Next up, we are going to set up a production environment. We're going to simulate a production environment with a server, with an application server that does more than just the Tomcat bundle. Why is that? We are using a full profile application server, which in our case, I can give you that up front, will be Wildfly. So with Wildfly as a full profile application server, we'll have something that implements everything that we get in the enterprise Java world. Well, at least everything that Wildfly has. We in Liferay don't need it. Maybe you need it in your own infrastructure. Maybe you have it running and this is the server of your choice that you are able to maintain. Because remember what I said earlier, what's the best server that you should run on? It's the one that you know best, that you know how to maintain, how to set up, how to recover in terms of disaster or in cases of disaster. So right now we don't need it, but we make use of it. One of these uses that we do is we're going to configure it for the JDBC connection. That's a database connection that we need anyways. Then we'll implement the Portlet API, Liferay's API, and the OSGI container. And those all are dependencies that are somewhat running outside of Liferay so that they're available a little bit further. Most notable, and you probably know that from any kind of server setup, is the database connection where you will need the database driver to be available to the application server or just to Tomcat. And that's just the most used or most known use for any extra component that you install on your application server anyways. On each server, you can customize quite a lot of parameters. For one, those are the Java memory settings, character sets, time zones, and then, of course, the database connectors. And with our setup on the application server, we will see an extended version of the database setup. Now, with regards to character set and time zone, we do recommend one setting, and that's please use UTC or GMT, however that's called in the parameter that you start your virtual machine. Set your server up on UTC, set Liferay up on UTC, and then on the user interface, there you can use whatever time zone you want. But as long as the server runs on just UTC, you will have all of the time zone calculations guaranteed to be correct. The other recommendation there is UTF-8. So we recommend to definitely nail your system on UTF-8. If you happen to run on any of the standard ones that we always come along, we always see in European systems, in ASCII-based systems, Latin 1 or ISO 8859-1, you will run into problems. Latest when you have someone with a non-ASCII alphabet entering their name. The Wildfly server settings, most of the people I know are using Tomcat. That's just everybody and their mother uses Tomcat, which is fine for Liferay, but the difference between Wildfly and Tomcat is that the configuration in Wildfly is or can be managed through a very nice user interface. It can also be managed through files, and within the Docker image we will actually see quite a lot of files because we want a reproducible build and not a reproducible clicking of the mouse, or it's the irreproducible clicking of the mouse. So we will rather use the scripts and the configuration files and the XML files that you will see within this exercise. When you deploy to an app server, and this is true for every app server, also for the WebSphere and the WebLogics of this world, then you typically can choose between war, ear, and jar deployment, and you might just need to put some files into a so-called exploded directory. In Tomcat, that works as well. Just in the web apps directory, enter any web application and Tomcat will pick it up. And that typically works as a hot deployment as well. Liferay itself is just a regular web application that runs on your application server. Now, you can deploy that just as every other web application. However, You will see there are some differences once you have deployed Liferay. I'll get to that a little bit later. Now, when you take Liferay's WAR file that we deliver for your application server, then you deploy that by any means you feel fit for your application server. You can just drop it in some hot deploy directory. You can have an exploded installation, an exploded jar file, exploded directory installation, or package it as an EAR file, whatever you think that works there. And after that, and this is not on the slide, after that, Liferay runs its own internal OSGI container. So if you deploy something else on top of this to Liferay, then you most likely will need a different deployment process than you are used to in your application server. Question here?
The EXP dependencies.
You still need the dependencies, yes. And we'll get to that with the exercise. So you can't just deploy Liferay, but you will need to make a couple of components, the Portlet API, for example, those available to the application server in a more global scope. So these are the so-called dependencies and the WAR files. Once the dependencies are known to the application server, the WAR file will deploy, but they both belong together. Now, connection pools, if you have ever configured Liferay just from the setup wizard, then you will see that your configuration file that these settings are persisted in looks a little bit like this. It gives you a driver class, it gives you a URL, a username, and a password. I've said we're simulating a production environment, and many system administrators that I know frown when they see this, because company policy clearly says there must not be a clear text password on the disk anywhere. And what do? Well, this is the standard and default configuration. Are you lost? No, you're not. We actually have a second method to configure where we even give you more flexibility. This is what you get when you just fill out the default setup wizard. But what you can get is you can just configure your connection pool through the application server, publish it as an application server publishes it through JNDI, and then have Liferay use the JNDI connection pool. With this, your advantage is you can even tweak all of the connection pool settings. How many concurrent connections do you allow? What are the parameters? How long will they survive? Will they be tested before they're handed out? And so on. Every single configuration that you see, that you know in a connection pool can be configured through your application server typically, rather than through the properties in Liferay's file. And they can even be updated at runtime. Your application server can do that. Liferay's property files can't do that. And we will see that when we look at the configuration for Liferay, because anything that you configure through this property file where you see the database connection requires a new restart of Liferay in order to be active. So you don't want your connection pool setting to be configured in this file. You'd rather want it configured through the application server. The settings that you will need to configure if you choose to do so look almost the same, jdbc.default.jndi.name. This just gives you the name of the connection pool that you configure in the application server, and Liferay will use it. So as you see here, with these settings, you just give the connection pool name, and there is no more username, no more password anywhere in Liferay's configuration files. Now, thinking a little bit ahead, when we do that with Tomcat, the JNDI connection pool configuration for Tomcat, for example, will end up on the disk. And what ends up on the disk is your clear text password. Bummer. Does this help or not? Well, first of all, there is an FAQ on Tomcat. How do I encrypt my password on the disk? Hint, it doesn't really work. So you cannot really encrypt. You can You can hide it a little bit, but there can't be proper encryption because you need the key anyways, or you'll need to enter the password anytime you start your server, which means you got to be around when there is an automatic restart of your server Sunday night at 3 o'clock. So that's for one, but on the other hand, we've mentioned that in previous chapters, this is Liferay training, this is not Tomcat training. So Liferay has no clue what the password is. It's Tomcat, it's Wildfly, it's WebLogic, it's WebSphere that know what the password is, and it's their task to properly protect the password. It's no longer Liferay's, and there it works just like with every other application server. They are going to protect it one way or another. But it's no longer up to Liferay that the password is stored somewhere and how it's encrypted or well, it can't be hashed. Well, how it's made unavailable anywhere. Good. Now, when we configure the Wildfly configuration, well, we first configure Wildfly, then we deploy Liferay in Wildfly, start up the Wildfly instance in a container, and then we'll log into the platform. That's basically all we do. This is DevOps, so system administration, which means once we have a running installation of Liferay DXP in front of us, we're done, we're good to go. We can actually shut it down. We won't cover anything on the user, well, we won't cover a lot on the user interface, a little bit maybe, but we don't do any content management with it in this class. But, well, as soon as the server runs, everything is fine. When you configure the Wildfly server, then you'll just check our pre-configured Wildfly Docker file. Just go through it, check what's being done. You will see that the dependencies, the public jar files for database connection driver and some other dependencies that you can typically download just from Liferay's website are being set up. Then we're going to deploy the WAR file. And we're going to configure a couple of things, for example, the connection pool, and then we're going to start it, run it with a final cmd command in the Docker file. You can also look at the Docker compose file where we set up everything else, for example, the database and the dependencies. Liferay DXP requires the database to run, so the database container hopefully runs already when DXP is started. And then you can look at the portal properties file. In our case, that's either portal ext properties or portal setup wizard properties. You will see which one that is. The standalone XML file is a Wildfly configuration file where you will see what's being done to it. And we also have an outgoing mail configuration, and just like with the database configuration, that can be configured through JNDI as well, so that again, Liferay has no clue of the password. So when you look at the configuration for your Wildfly server, you will see some configuration done in portal properties, and you will see if it's called portal ext property, portal setup wizard properties, and you will also see the standalone XML configuration, which is a Wildfly specific configuration. If you do know Wildfly, you know what I'm talking about. If you don't know Wildfly, this is your hint. Standalone XML is a Wildfly configuration file, so just look at it. It's an XML file. It's well understandable, I would say. And then we can test changes to the outgoing mail configuration. There you'll see where do we deliver our mail to. And again, just like with the JNDI configuration for the database, we will just connect to the mail server through JNDI, which means Liferay has no clue what the password is that we're using to send outgoing mail. Now, the final exercise in here that you'll see after this video finishes, we'll update portal ext properties, update the standalone XML, update the Wildfly dependencies. Then we're going to rebuild the service and test outgoing mails, which gives you a hint what we update the dependencies with. So we gotta be able to send mail through the application server, and after this you will be able to run Liferay DXP on your Wildfly system, send outgoing mail, connect to the local database, and go on with content management, put in content as you like, which is then out of focus for this course. Ready for the exercises? I've skipped a couple, but we'll add them all after this chapter. So, exercises, take out your propeller head, go, build the Docker files, build the Docker images, and start the containers. Ready, set, go.